we are between two world orders. The world is too interconnected.
Will it be fair if one was to argue that we are into a new globalization, in the sense when the tariffs are right on our heads?
Obviously, India has been a votary of reforming the old order, not throwing it out.
REVA University presents REVA Podcast.
Thank you, Ms. Suhasini Haider, for joining us at REVA University studio. It's a kind of a time at which the whole world is in a flux. And Ukraine war is continuing, Hamas conflict never ending. The whole system per se appears to be in a kind of a flux of sorts. How do you see a kind of, how would it unravel in the coming months or days for that matter?
Well, thank you, Professor Sakuja, and thank you for having me at REVA University. It's always a pleasure to be here. I think if you were to look at the world broadly, we are in a plastic moment. You know, they say history has plastic moments where you haven't actually stopped, where you're between molds. So we are between two world orders. If the international world order in the previous century was about globalization, about multilateralization, about issues like development, economy, climate change being put at the forefront, the United Nations being put at the forefront. I'm not saying there wasn't conflict before, but now what we're looking at is a world order we are moving towards right now, where might is right, or at least nobody is going to stop the powerful, where essentially rules don't matter anymore. So the UN rules don't matter. WTO rules don't matter because the US wants to put new tariffs. Rules of sovereignty and territorial integrity don't matter when it comes to, say, China's Belt and Road Initiative. So you have a scenario where it is the global powers who were, in a sense, the guarantors of the previous world order, who have decided to shift and become very unpredictable, and in a certain sense are breaking the old order with their actions. Now, how that plays out in the next few decades, I think will be important. I think it'll be important to see if a new order can be built. Obviously, India has been a votary of reforming the old order, not throwing it out, of reforming the old order so it is more representative. So a country like India, which has the world's highest population, has the largest part of it. But also where there is some amount of equity between the developed world and the developing world.
I take a cue from what you said in terms of the new world order and how does India fit into that. Will it be fair if one was to argue that we are into a new globalization, in the sense when the tariffs are right on our heads and they are literally disturbing the so-called predictability of the global economic order? Can we take it as a new globalization, prefixed with all kinds of, let's say, tensions of sorts? Or is it a kind of a moment in the history where we can say a new global order emerged, a kind of a new globalization has now come, and let's reconcile to it?
Sure, and I think you're absolutely right that it's not necessarily that globalization, we're just going for deglobalization, because that's not really an option. The world is too interconnected in terms of both security and in terms of actual technology. We're just too interconnected to completely deglobalize and each go their own way. On the other hand, what we are seeing right now is that globalization has brought a lot of problems with it. I think this began maybe in 2008 with the global financial crisis, where people started looking, and particularly in developed countries, started looking at globalization and saying, I haven't benefited. Those who have benefited are further down the trade chain. America, for example, said we're no longer manufacturing anything. We have to import everything from other countries. We're dependent on other countries' supply chains. So kind of desire then to rebuild, in a sense, new supply chains began from there itself. The second part against globalization became the idea that local handicrafts, that every country had its own speciality, and that somehow went away, because now what we were seeing was that you took one part from one country, another part from, you had a global assembly line, but as a result authenticity of cultures was going away, and we've seen it in India, where plastic toys would come and take the place of a wooden toy in India, or localized culture would give way to some globalized sort of pop culture, if you like. So that was the second part to this backlash against globalization. I think the third part was the rise of very, very charismatic, but not necessarily democratic leaders. So we've had leaders around the world who took on almost authoritarian tones, even though they were notionally running democracies, because of the power of their personalities. It was about personalities, about talking about that grievance from globalization, the idea that refugees and immigrants were coming and ruining the cultures of these countries. So we've seen this process go on for the last maybe 20 years, at least in this century, we've seen a lot of it. The new globalization may unfortunately mean a duo globalization in terms of polarization. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, for example, the US and Europe decided that they were going to cut all ties with Russia. Now, this was against the idea of globalization, yet nobody objected, because the Western world, which is supposed to be liberals, were supposed to be the custodians of globalization. And here they were saying, we won't do business with you. We will pull out all our companies from Russia. We won't sell anything to Russia. We won't buy their energy. We won't allow the Bolshoi Ballet to perform anywhere in the world. In certain universities, we won't teach Dostoevsky anymore, or Tolstoy won't be read. So complete, kind of breaking away from Russia that happened. Now we see a different kind of duo globalization, where countries like Russia, China, the BRICS countries, for example, are saying, well, if the US is going to put these tariffs on us, if the US is going to be unreasonable, maybe we need to think about an alternate economic world order. So these countries are now, and the BRICS is now 10 countries, it's not just the original 5, are talking not right now in terms of an alternate currency, but in terms of national currencies. Trading amongst themselves in terms of what they can take from each other, and essentially building a counter world narrative. So I think it's an interesting time if you're an analyst, because you are seeing that you can't do away with globalization. But what is the new form it's going to take is very interesting.
And taking on from what you said in terms of BRICS, do you think it's got the gravitas that it needed? Maybe it's, let's say it's in its infancy in those many terms. I'm not even suggesting it is challenging the say US power, because President Trump has been most vocal about it. Yes. You go ahead with a country with a new currency, and I'm going to trouble you for that. So do you think over the period of time, multilateral organizations such as BRICS, they'll start mushrooming, or maybe at some stage, a more powerful emerges, which is there ready to confront?
Well, in a certain sense, Mr. Trump has given it a larger fillip, if you ask me, by speaking about BRICS the way he does. Look, when BRICS first came out in the early 2000s, in fact in 2000, where Jim O'Neill, this economist, thought up the idea of BRICS as the rise of the rest. Yes. That means it wasn't any longer the G7 or G8 in those days that would only drive change in the world, that there were these emerging economies. So he looked at the world's most interesting economies at the time, and he said Brazil, in fact Brazil wasn't a part of the, South Africa wasn't part of the original. Yes. There was Brazil, Russia, India and China, and then South Africa joined. It was always a slightly underrated organization. Nobody really thought it had much value. When Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, I think, went for the first summit of BRICS in 2008, 2009, it was almost laughed out. By 2013-14, many of these economies were no longer emerging. In fact, they weren't doing very well. Russia was not doing very well. India went through ups and downs. And so people thought they could just write BRICS off. And then suddenly you see this new version of BRICS, which has doubled in size. I think every idea comes at a certain time for a certain reason. And what we were discussing just now, this idea that people start to look for an alternate world order. After all, if the G8 or the G7 now, as it's called, is essentially an elitist club, how can they represent the concerns of the rest of the world? The UN P5, the permanent members of the Security Council, they don't represent most of the world, certainly. And even if you were to see that the US and Russia and China are definitely the most powerful countries in the world, but the UK and France are not seen like that. So why should they be permanent members? So there's a kind of rebellion, if you ask me, against this idea that the world must be governed in this particular way. Here's the hierarchy. And therefore, when you see BRICS coming with not just the original 5, but then countries like UAE, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, and now Indonesia, you realize that there is an internal interest in the world to how they can mix it up a little bit. Now, whether it can be a serious challenger or not, I think only time will tell. One has to remember, though, that these countries now represent, I think, 40% of the world population, but they also represent I think 3 out of the top, or maybe 7 out of the top 10 oil producers in the world. So we're looking at countries that have a certain heft, energy security and other types of security, if you look at Russia and China and India, that are going to make them important. I think India has been sensible in the sense that it has kept one foot in every boat. So we are part of the Quad, we are part of the BRICS, we are part of the SCO, we are part of IPEF. How long that continues remains to be seen, but for the moment, it seems to be the only stable place to be.
One last bit, I can't resist asking you this. India was, or for that matter, New Delhi was able to catapult G20 to a kind of, let's say, a strata of sorts, then it has to be taken forward. Do you think that kind of a charisma, or for that matter, leadership exists, which will take it to the next level in the coming years?
So the G20 was always meant to be the counter, in a sense, to the G8 or the G7. The idea that these countries couldn't alone run the world anymore. And the G20 began with all these great ideas. It came at the same time as you were seeing other changes in the economic structures. The WTO came about, and Soviet Union had collapsed. So Russia was a big part of the world, the world stage at that time. Other changes had happened. Energy security had become very important. You were suddenly seeing people wanting to move away from the conflicts of the past. The 90s were a heady time. That's when the G20 really came into its own. I think there needs to be a new idea, because we've seen the G20, although the Indian G20 was wildly successful and was able to bring countries together on certain issues, eventually there needs to be some understanding of where this is headed. Is this a stopgap to a larger grouping? Because then you have the United Nations. After all, there's this book called The G0 World by Ian Bremmer, who said, how can you have a G8, a G10, a D10, a G3, a G4? So sooner or later we'll just have a G0 world where everybody's on their own and nobody comes together. So I think there needs to be thought, just as we have to rethink the UN, we have to rethink New World Order, we have to rethink globalization. We probably need to rethink the G20.
Thank you very much. I think there's a lot of substance in the way you argued, the way the global order is shifting, the interest-based groups are emerging, or these groupings, sometimes we label them as trilateral and bilateral. But then here, again, it'll remain a kind of a, let's say, I don't want to use the word flux, more like a kind of a new order, world order, each one shaping a kind of a discourse at one particular time. Thank you so much for joining us at REVA University Studio. It's a pleasure, and we look forward to receiving you more often.
I hope to be here again. Thank you.
Thank you.